Irish countryside. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so nice to be back here again. A couple of points, I guess, before we get into all of this technology stuff. First of all, it's become clear that people like Elif and myself come bouncing back and forth here all the time. Not because of technology, but because we got to know people. I got to know Odgeir many years ago, we became friends, and so he sends me an email and says, can you come out? And I said, sure, I'd love to come out, we'll have a meal, we'll go out and we'll do stuff. So it comes down to people, right, which is as true in Silicon Valley as everywhere else. It's all about people, communities. There's a reason why most of all that high-tech stuff is in a very small geographic area. It's because it's all done on a personal basis. As I'll probably talk about tomorrow, I have a startup company which is beginning to do quite well now. Almost all of the key connections and the information I got and the help I got in starting my company was gained either on a road bike or a mountain bike, because when I bike with my friends in the valley, I'm talking to VCs, angels, CEOs, CTOs, people who can do big data analytics, yada, yada, yada. So it's all just done socially. The other thing I want to mention is I was a department chair for 4 years, a dean for 8 years, and a couple of things you realize when you get into, especially in academic administration, is you really can't tell anybody to do anything, and there's very little control you have over what people do, but what you can do is put them in a position where they have to reflect on what they do. You can make some things not happen, so they have to readjust. And I took the view, and I went to workshops to sort of reinforce this, that the best thing I could do was you do something like you change the timetable, you change some reporting structure, so everyone has to reflect on what they do and reassess. You make it so they can't go back to where they were, but they could get back close. And it's about just making people reflect, because we get in jobs, we tend to channel ourselves, we keep going, and if something comes along that forces us to reflect, that in itself is good. And in many ways, I think MOOCs are like that. It made a lot of people, certainly at Stanford, it made people reflect on their teaching, and in many cases, it made them reflect on teaching as an enterprise for the first time in their careers. And that becomes clear if you look at the videos of people as they were speaking when they set up Coursera and Udacity and Nova Ed and so forth, and the kind of things they say today. People have become much wiser at a research university like Stanford about education and learning than was the case beforehand. There's a more likelihood now that someone in computer science or engineering will actually talk to someone in the School of Education before they do anything, because they've realized that people in schools of education actually do know stuff that's useful. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about MOOCs in fact, I'm going to be talking about one MOOC, mainly because, in fact, if you go to people talking about MOOCs, they almost always end up talking about their own MOOC, for good reason, because there are no experts on MOOCs. The most we have expert on is the MOOC we've designed and given, and the same is true of me. But as I go through, I'll be focusing on my own MOOC, which is in mathematics, but it's really the general issues that I want to get at. It's not a talk about MOOCs in particular or my MOOC, it's a talk about this general principle of what's happening when MOOCs come along. What are we having to reassess? And then we're actually reassessing almost the whole spectrum of higher education. Okay, if we go back to the origins of something that definitely was called and is recognized as a MOOC, we have to go back to Canada in around 2008. Canada, of course, because it's in Norway, so it's very similar. You've got lots of space, people spread apart, very cold, difficult to travel around, so people tend to be in their homes, separated a lot of the time. And so Canada, especially with its sort of smaller colleges, has this outreach activities. Athabasca University, in particular in the middle of Canada, where George Siemens used to be, Stephen Downes and so forth, they pioneered something that became known as MOOCs. I mean, pioneered is a little bit wrong, because this is a history they're building on. History that certainly includes the UK and the Open University. When I was growing up as a lad, Harold Wilson's initiative with the Open University. So this has been going on a long time. Stanford's online learning since the internet began and so forth, and before that with television. So people have been using media to sort of spread the word for a long time. But in 2008 in Canada was something that was definitely called a MOOC. In fact, Dave Cormier from Prince Edward Island, University of Prince Edward Island, gave its name. Massive open online course. It's subsequently been called a CMOOC. But it was this one course that Siemens and Stephen Downes gave that really sort of started that particular ball rolling. Then, 3 years later, totally independently, coming out of a different initiative, Stanford launched its MOOC with Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig's course on artificial intelligence. And that had nothing in common, really, with what was going on in Canada. And I don't believe that when they picked up on that word MOOC, they really had it, that the Stanford people had any idea of exactly what had been going on in Canada. But it's a cute name. It obviously is inspired by massive online gaming, MMOs, massively multiplayer online games, etc., etc. Okay. In the case of the Canadian one, and that's really embedded in a large culture, at least in North America, US and Canada, of particularly the 2-year colleges, and to some extent the lesser-known 4-year colleges, that deal with students who have jobs, that have evening classes. There's an enormous amount of effort been going on for many years into online learning for those students. They tend to be very small classes, maybe 50, 100 classes, maybe less. These days, much more loose structured, certainly open access. But that whole community, the idea was there was a regular class going on. They were using RSS feeds, various threaded discussions on various online media, blog posts, use of Second Life back then, and synchronous online meetings using Skype or whatever was available, in order to just open it up to a larger audience. The thing that happened at Stanford came out of research that was going on, joint research between the computer science department and Stanford School of Education, into developing an online platform for internal Stanford use. The problem that was being solved, people have said, what was the problem that Stanford MOOCs were designed to solve? The problem was that Stanford's undergraduate computer science majors had pushing 700 students in the first year class. And the computer science faculty said, we can't teach 700 students, it's ridiculous. We'll use our expertise to build a platform so we can record the lectures, and then that will sort of ease the load so that we can have TAs talking to the students. So the problem was a lot of computer science students at Stanford that had to be catered for. And so as a project, they developed this platform that eventually became known as Class to Learn, Class to Go. That actually became the basis of edX when it migrated away. But again, the idea was there was a regular class going on, there was this platform, and all that happened was that Thrun and Norvig, giving their annual regular AI course, decided to put a version of it up on the web and make it open. And in the case of the Canadian one, about 2,300 students outside the university took part in that. And in the case of the Stanford one, 160,000 students took part. The one on the left was of interest in the community because it's a little-known Canadian university. Stanford, because it's a sort of a famous university in Silicon Valley and there's billions of dollars of venture funding floating around in the neighborhood, became a story in the New York Times. And that's essentially what happened. It just sort of blew up and you get all of these people. Based on very flimsy evidence, because a course in advanced artificial intelligence is atypical. First of all, it was dealing with students who were motivated, wanted to learn AI, were coders, were used to using technology, and were in a discipline, introductory AI, which is essentially learned by instruction. This was a classic old instructional model of giving a lecture, taking notes, and going away and writing code. And the other part to that, of course, is programming courses are, by their nature, machine gradable. Right? You just put it in, and if it compiles, it's okay. In fact, if it compiles, it's a miracle. But if it compiles, you're okay, and you've sort of graded it. So almost all of that hype and that story was based on a very atypical case that was almost accidental. But it became a story, and it became a big story, and all of a sudden we have this MOOC phenomenon. And as Odger said, that we're down on the other side of that curve now. There was this classic curve, not of the development. The development's been going steadily. It was going before then. It's still going. What went down was the hype and the unrealistic hype. People are becoming much more savvy about this thing. But the enterprise of online learning, the enterprise of looking at education and revising it and reflecting on it due to technology, that's going ahead, as are discussions about the financing of higher education and the structure of higher education. I think it would be foolish in the extreme to think that MOOCs and MOOC platforms and MOOC technology will not fundamentally change the way higher education is funded. It will change it. It will change the way universities are structured. It will change the way we hire faculty and the way we allocate resources within the university. Not least because this kind of room is already looking anachronistic. It's very unlikely that at least 5 or 10 years from now any students will take their classes in large rooms. One thing that will certainly happen is the recording and the use of flipped classrooms, which I think most people have now realised are fundamentally advantageous. I was at Princeton this last semester as visiting professor, and I was giving an undergraduate class. And since I have my online course, I scheduled the online course to be at the same time as the Princeton semester. I brought it forward into the beginning of February, so my MOOC started at the beginning of February. And it ran in the same time as the course, because at Princeton I was using my online course as a flipped classroom for the course. And so I wasn't lecturing to my students at Princeton. It was a small class. There were only 9 undergraduates. They got a lot of attention, and they weren't being lectured by me. We were being discussed with me because they were watching the lectures at home. And at periods throughout the term, I asked the students, and for many of them they'd never had this particular kind of experience. I said, would you prefer it, and if necessary I would have swapped, if I actually spent more time in the class giving the lectures, or are you happy watching them online and doing the quizzes online and doing them that way? And absolutely, they said they much preferred to watch them online in their own time, when they could pause, rewind, think about things, and then when they were in class, talk to me. So they were absolutely clear that they preferred not to be lectured at, but to be talked with, and to watch the lectures in their own time, because then they were in charge of the lecture, not me. I was then a resource that was at their disposal, rather than in the lecture room, where I have to try and judge the speed to the whole class, and some could be bored and some could move ahead. So all of the advantages of them being on individual control hit home, and they absolutely preferred that. So there's no way I would ever again give a course where I do basic lecturing. And that, since that's almost certainly going to happen to everybody, changes the way universities allocate staff. Because at least in mathematics, the basic unit by which you justify faculty is the calculus section. How many calculus sections? You determine the maximum size of a calculus section, and that tells you how many faculty you need, because everybody teaches one section of calculus or 2 sections of calculus. And that's the basic unit of currency for how many faculty you have. Take that away, you have to come up with a different university, a different form of allocation within the system. So I think things like that are just going to change the way we deal with things internally. Okay, the terms that came out subsequently, and I think this was in a paper written by a scholar in Japan, if I remember, a British scholar in Japan, I think was the paper. But in any case, someone wrote a paper reflecting on these MOOCs and called the original MOOC from Canada, the C MOOC, C not standing necessarily for Canadian, but it could, rather connectionist or community, and the X standing for who knows, except X was in currency in the West Coast. We have things like Media X, Bio X, Nano X. It was a term of art. In fact, last year at the conference, my colleague Martha Russell, the now director of Media X, gave a talk as well. And the focus there was just on scalability, the massive part of it. In terms of technologies, that means XMOOCs are sort of YouTube. It's basically university education meets YouTube. You put stuff on video and you put it out there for everyone to access. And the technology analog of CMOOCs is Facebook, because it's about social interaction. I'm not saying those are the platforms. It's just that Facebook is about taking what we do in small groups with physical co-presence and blasting it out to make it open access on the web. And so it's all about interaction between people. So those are the general areas of technology that the 2 kinds of MOOCs fall into. The XMOOCs quite clearly are well suited to the basic courses in things like math, science, engineering, many courses in CS, courses where there's a ton of material to be learned and you simply want the most efficient way of getting information out of a textbook into the mind of a student. And classically it came via the voice and the hand of a professor, for reasons to do with the limitations in photocopying in medieval Italy and medieval Europe, because if you go back into the 12th, 13th century when higher education was being invented, the only way to distribute information was for one person with the handwritten manuscript to go into a room, to write it on a board and have it copied by 25 students, and there you've got 25 copies. So it was a very early form of photocopy machine that gave us the modern lecture. And when we now have many more sophisticated technologies, that's clearly rather anachronistic. Okay, but so for courses that have this amount of information flow as part of the core process, these platforms work very well. And not surprisingly, they were the early MOOCs that were in those kinds of disciplines, and they were the ones for which there's been the most success. The C MOOCs are much more suited, in fact they're almost essential, if you want to do anything to do with the humanities, and indeed to do advanced courses in maths, science and engineering. When you get to the stage where you have to critique each other, discuss things, get together in small groups, then it's all about human interaction. And I think one of the lessons that was learned, especially at places like Stanford in the engineering and computer science schools and elsewhere, about education, that is only just being learned by the education funding community, the investors. They're only just beginning to realize that there are aspects of education that simply are not scalable. So Odgeir began at the beginning by talking about the way we've had revolutions in journalism and music and entertainment and various kinds of media, where the old model literally just got blown away. In education, I think for sure, we're going to see the old model change dramatically, but it's not going to be blown out of the water, because education, when it comes down to it, is not scalable. You still need these small groups interacting with someone who knows what they're talking about. And that's not going to go away, so you're not going to need, there's not going to be massive reductions in people employed, at least not if we want to maintain good education. But what they do with their time is going to change. And I know in my own case, having been sort of at the beginning of this curve, what I'm doing with my time is much more fun. It was much more fun chatting with those students at Princeton, not feeling I had to worry because we were not going to finish this topic by the end of the day, but saying, let's come back to that next time, because everything, the stuff that they had to get through that determined the course was all online and could be taken in their own time. But we were just able to fool around and just chat and just help them get to be a part of a learning community. So it was a much more fun, relaxed period of time that we had together, and I think all of us would much more enjoy that. Okay, so there were all these courses where the C MOOCs are certainly well suited for at least providing part of what's going on. Stanford was never in the MOOC business as such. Stanford did what Stanford always did. If there's something that's commercializable, it moves off the campus instantly in the form of a startup company. So as soon as Udacity, as Norvig and Thron had given their course, they spun off and this was always their intention actually, they spun off this company Udacity as an independent for-profit. Coming out of, down here we have another platform that came out of the business school at Stanford, the Graduate School of Business, Nova Ed. Business courses, of course, are heavily on human interaction. They're trying to teach people how to do well in business. So it's all about building community and networking. That's been an important part of business. And Nova Ed is a very networky sort of a platform to try and see how you can extend networking interactions beyond the classroom, beyond a bar or a hotel room or wherever people network. And then in between, we had these two platforms, Coursera and edX, which was sort of one and the other. They had, for example, Coursera, although it was clearly an ex-MOOC, it was a platform designed for millions of students to be able to access. It had a well-built discussion forum. It had a capability for peer evaluation of work. It was certainly very clearly thinking about courses in the humanities. And edX as well, which was that Class to Go platform that sort of migrated across to the East Coast, and Stanford is part of that, which sort of lives in between them. There are now, by the way, certainly in Silicon Valley, there are at least half a dozen companies which are offering front ends to edX. edX is open source, which means if you want to, you can just download it. Any university in the world can download the code and then start working on it and build their own front end and put their own branding on it. But there are many for-profit startups in Silicon Valley now that offer a front end and hosting based on edX. They took edX, they sort of developed a more robust and a more user-friendly front end. And so many companies, many other organizations, many educational institutions are now going to these other companies. In fact, my own video game company, we're talking about using one of those platforms ourselves in order to put materials out and discuss materials to do with the educational video games we're building. We're actually using a platform called CourseMaster probably, but at least we're talking about using that one, we're looking at it. But it's just one of many. So there's a lot of activity in sort of tailoring and making it possible to use MOOC platforms, not to reach millions of people, but just to provide a robust, usable platform that allows us to use the web to provide educational products. So I already mentioned that one of the things both of those platforms did was group discussions and peer evaluation, people stuff. Wisdom of the crowds, pulling on wisdom of the crowds to make things happen. So we've got this general constellation of different flavors of MOOCs and MOOC platforms. Okay. You can say a lot about it. I mean, when it comes down to it, a lot of this is hardly revolutionary. It's hardly revolutionary. It's very traditional stuff. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You know, we've been using educational systems for thousands of years. We've got familiar with them. You know, it's always good to sort of reflect on them, but there's often a good reason why something has lasted for many generations. It's because it works. And it clearly does work, at least for some of us, because we're in a room like this as a result of it working. And so an awful lot of this is very familiar stuff. It's being evolved. I've evolved my own MOOC, and many other people are giving MOOCs evolve them too. So you have some form of lectures and presentations. That's still very much part of what's going on. And on that material, you get things like written material, the usual sort of stuff. Since it's now full multimedia, you can have embedded videos, you can have sound, you can have a whole bunch of stuff. So it's very rich. We don't yet have tactile interaction in most of these courses, or few laboratory ones do. But eventually it'll be tactile. When touch screens get to push back, that will be there as well. So that'll come, and you can use the full modalities of the technology. So you get this full media spectrum of capabilities. The material may actually just appear on the screen. It can be generated on the screen. I'll make some reflections on my own research into that in a moment. The presenter may or may not appear on the screen. One of the most successful educational outreach devices programs, companies, was Khan Academy in the US. And Salman Khan never appears on screen. All you see, you don't even see his hand, you just see a moving pen and the voice. And that's had millions and millions of users for reasons that I can comment on later if we want to. But it's a very, very basic. All you see is a tablet screen and a pen moving and writing stuff down with a voice. And it's been extremely successful, reached a lot of people, and has a very, very strong following. And the presenter may appear separately from the material or with the material. That has advantages and disadvantages. It can be live streamed if there's need for live synchronous activity, or it can just be downloadable. I mean, one of the things MOOCs offer the possibility of is delivering education or making education available in different parts of the world, and many parts of the world don't have high bandwidth access. The best they can do if there's a lecture is download it over a night, over a Wi-Fi, over a cellular network or whatever, and then play it the next day. There are all sorts of bells and whistles coming in. One of the things that's good with recorded lectures is you can put in interactive quizzes, which research many years ago at SRI and Xerox PARC, SRI in particular, showed that if you have these lectures and you punctuate them by quizzes every 3 or 4 minutes, just little quizzes, then the learning is much more effective because it stops you sitting passively. You have to act. I mean, teachers do the same thing when they ask the class questions, but in that kind of a setting, students are usually reluctant to say anything. Whereas if you're sitting at your own in front of a computer, pushing a button that says yes or no is low risk, and people do that. And that turns out to be very effective in keeping people engaged with the material. In my own case, the idea is to make them much more like video games, because as we know, video games are incredibly engaging if they're well developed. And so the more we can make these learning experiences like video games, the more effective they're likely to be. Okay, so the materials can be either appeared on the screen or downloadable. There are machine-graded work assignments where that's possible. There are peer-evaluated work assignments where you can't rely on machine grading. If the classes are smaller, of course, you can have them graded by instructors and TAs, but then they're no longer massive, although many of the uses of the MOOC platforms now are for these much smaller courses. And discussion forums are always a huge part of it. Typically at the moment they're text-based. They don't have to be, but that's a very effective way of doing it. The standard sort of threaded discussion forum that you have on blogs, for example, that kind of thing is very, very effective. There are certainly plenty of MOOCs being offered on WordPress, or just on blogs. I know in Canada there's been experiments with just giving MOOCs essentially on Twitter. You just sort of put stuff out on Twitter and just let the thing organically develop. All you need is a medium that will transmit stuff, and then just let people be creative with it. Typically these involve things like up and down voting, at least with the massive courses, so you can see what the trending topic it is, like trending in Twitter. And it's very valuable for the instructor to see what's trending in your class, what's causing the problems, what are people finding easy, and if there's a mechanism for voting up and voting down postings, that means the instructor and the TAs can keep in close contact, or at least keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the course. There are, to a greater or lesser extent, the MOOC platforms can and will offer mechanisms for seeding and forming groups. At the moment, these tend to be left to the individual groups to form. But certainly in my course, I wanted students to be in small groups of between 5 and maybe a dozen students to work together, either physically co-located if they're in a physical, if that's possible, or at least by forming a network online, in order to work together and collaborate. Okay, and then there's various things that sort of, if you want it to be a synchronous course, and there are certainly some advantages to doing that, then you need things like a schedule, deadlines, maybe a final exam, some form of evaluation and certification. You can bring in, it's a matter of choice as to which one of these features from existing education are brought in. The images on the right, top right is an image screenshot from, in many ways an iconic screenshot from my MOOC, although it's not totally representative. Beneath that, there's a course from University of Pennsylvania on calculus. We in the US, I think, were the first 2 regular math classes that went out on MOOCs. Then beneath that, we've got Joe Bowler's class. Those 2 are on Coursera. Then we've got Joe Bowler's class on math education that went out on edX last year. And then I forget what the bottom right one is. That looks like it's too small. I think it's a computer networking class that came out. But various different kinds of things, presentations, but they sort of capture sort of what people see on the screen. Not totally, and when I go into my own course a little bit more detail, as an example, we'll see exactly how it cashed out. So my course was called Introduction to Mathematical Thinking. The first one was in September 2012. It was a 7-week course. Then I gave it again in the following spring. It became 10 weeks. Same material, but I'd adjusted given the feedback of the class. It was offered again in the fall of 2013, and then it was offered again in the spring of this year, and it's just nicely finished. And again, it was 10 weeks, but it was a different structure. These were not the same course, because I kept changing them based on the feedback from the student. And one of the hugely advantageous things about giving a MOOC is you get massive amounts of data very quickly. And it's not a small sample. In my own case, these were quite significantly sized classes. The kind of, in case you have never ever logged on to one of these things, they're not designed to be exciting. They just sort of give a ton of information, a lot of written material. And if you log on to mine, this is the home page of my course. This was actually when the thing began in the spring version of 2013. This was the course that came out. And there's a menu, there's various facilities that are offered. And this is basically just the bulletin board that's the sort of the heart of the course, and then students sort of come into that and go out into various other parts of it. In my own case, I actually wrote a textbook to go with the course. For reasons to do with the course design, I wanted there to be an optional textbook. It had to be a print textbook. Well, you can buy an electronic version, but it had to be a separate book. And for various reasons, I wanted it to be an artifact that was bought. But I didn't want it to be dependent on the on students having money, so I actually just self-published this on Amazon, so you could buy it at $9.99, which is basically the cost of Amazon printing the thing. So this is essentially a book at cost, so students who wanted a book could buy a book. And there were various discussions, I'll give a reference later on as to why I wanted that to be a separate artifact that was for pay. As I say, it was actually produced at cost. And about 10% of the students actually obtained that. But as with most of these MOOCs, the idea was to reach a very large audience independent of their abilities to pay and be supported. And so the MOOC itself was free, and the idea was that they didn't really need the book, but for students who wanted it, there was an optional extra. In terms of numbers, this is how it cashed out. In the first time I gave it, these MOOCs were new, 2012, this was when just after Coursera had been founded. So I was one of the first wave, I was at the end of the first wave of courses on Coursera. And so I had over 100,000 students. There were very few courses available then. So anyone was interested in MOOCs, I got a lot of attention from the media because it was the math MOOC after these things were launched, especially it was the only math MOOC at Stanford. So it was a 7-week course. It was a standard course I'd given at Stanford many times, modified to work on the web. 111,000 that time. Of that 111,000, about 84,000 actually showed up. Now, this is like the airlines. A lot of people buy a ticket and don't get on the plane, and quite a lot of people, there's no cost to signing up. Literally no cost in either, almost no cost in time and definitely no cost in money. So a lot of people sign up. About 84,000 of them actually showed up at least once, and about 7,000 completed. It's very hard to say what completed means. I just went through and looked at who was still submitting work in the last week. So during the last week, about 7,000 students submitted an assignment. So that was quite a substantial class. The spring, there was a whole wave of courses came online, so there was more selection. And my course doesn't really fit in the spring of a university anyway. It's an introductory university course, so typically given in the fall. So it did, as I expected, drop 41,000, of which 32,000 showed up, and about 2,000 completed. Fall 2013, the course was changing as I kept iterating it. It's back up to almost 62,000, of which almost 50,000 showed up at least once, and about 3,500 completed. The last time I gave it, I actually split it into 2 parts, a basic 8-week course and a 2-week separate course. And that'll be where I talk about the kind of things you end up doing when you look at the data and you look at what these students are doing, and you change the way you structure courses, you change the way you give them. I made quite a few structural changes, one of which there was an 8-week course and a 2-week experience at the end. And of that, about 3,000 students finished the basic course, and about just short of 2,000 students stayed on and did an extra 2 weeks of fairly intense interaction that was very community-oriented. So there was a more instructional-based 8 weeks than a totally community-oriented thing at the end. And quite frankly, I was very surprised that as many as 1,700 showed up for that. And about 900 of them actually completed it to a fairly substantial degree. So that was, for me, that was actually quite a fun part of the course to see how that went. Okay, let's just say a little bit about the way I've structured mine. This is particular to mine, and the general take-home message is you look at your own discipline, you look at your own course, and you say, how do I take what I've been doing for years and put it on a MOOC platform and get it out there? And in my case, I picked the model that I think all mathematicians agree is the one most successful way of learning mathematics, which is to sit alongside an expert. You really, at a university, only ever get good mathematics education as a graduate student, as a PhD student. Until then, you get a very inferior product because of the nature of mathematics. Mathematics is hugely human-centered and totally one-on-one interaction required to do it well. And so you just don't get even close if you have even small group discussions. So my idea was to sort of take that as my basic model, graduate school education, which is when, as I say, when most of us actually learn what mathematics is. Coupled with small group work, mathematics is notorious for being dangerous to learn on your own. It's very easy to think you're right when you're not, and small group work mitigates that. When I gave it, there were lectures. Each one had an assignment sheet, for group work, where they looked at each other's work and helped themselves. And then there was a machine-graded problem set to sort of just give reassurance to them and me that they were actually in sync with reality. But it was that was the focus of the thing. It wasn't what was on the screen. It was all about what they did when they worked together. And by and large, the students who did well were the ones who got into groups. And the students who didn't do well were the ones who didn't get into groups. That basically repeated the research of Uri Treisman at UC Berkeley back in the 70s, who figured out why it was that African-American students in Oakland, California, did very bad at mathematics. It was actually because there's a tradition, those kids worked on their own. And so they never got feedback from anybody else. And what Treisman did was change the structure so they had to work together with graduate students from Berkeley to sort of coordinate them. And as soon as they were able to work together and encouraged to work together, and that was made possible, their scores went up. So it wasn't poverty, it wasn't other things, it was actually that they weren't working the right way. And once they worked the right way, their math scores went up. That was back in the 70s. So this is sort of, but the model I'm taking is really, that's as old as it gets. It's the classical apprenticeship model, where you sit alongside the expert and you observe stuff and you absorb it by osmosis. Okay. In this course, we look at some different ways of proving statements. In the case of my 4 examples, 1, 3, and 4 are true, but 2 is false. So I don't appear very often on the screen, and when I do, there's virtually nothing of importance behind me. In that case, it was just some material, and then that's followed by a quiz. So I've said something, and then this says, were you listening? Because these quizzes pop up all the time. So the idea is to make people a little bit apprehensive so that they're actually engaged. And the quiz basically says, did you listen to what I just said? In which case, you would have realized that the answer was 5. I was talking about proofs. So that's the basic format when I'm on. I'm just a screen. There's something behind me, just some information. But I'm on occasionally. In the beginning, I'm on more because I'm trying to establish human contact. But as the course goes on, my face disappears and something else takes its place. But that was the sort of the introductory thing, and the quiz came up, and if you click proof, the video would start to play again, and this would come up. Let me show you a proof of the first statement. It's due to the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid, who lived around 350 BCE.
We show that if we list the primes, P1, P2, P3, etc., the list continues forever. Well, suppose we've reached some stage n. So we've listed P1, P2, P3 up to Pn. Can we find another prime to continue the list? If we can always find another prime, then the list goes on forever, and we've shown that there are infinitely many primes. Well, can we? Which means the list can always be continued.
Well, obviously the students saw
that there were infinitely many primes.
The students saw the thing in real time, except the handwriting was speeded up. What I did was and this was based largely on Khan Academy. I did a bunch of experiments before I came to the course. Khan Academy had been very successful by then. I'd talked several times to Sal Khan. And I thought, if I can make it work that way on a tablet, that's the way to go. Turned out that for advanced mathematics, you can't make it work on a tablet, for reasons that I'll explain in a minute when we look at what happens next. You needed the hand. The hand absolutely had to be there. That was true of some of the courses on Udacity. There's an issue then about whether you can see what's beneath the hand, especially if you're left-handed. I did have to change the way I write in order to bring my hand down rather than across. But there is still an issue of the hand being on top. Udacity got around that by making the hand translucent, which I still find creepy. And you habituate quickly, but to me a translucent hand brings memories of really crappy sci-fi movies on television back in the 50s and 60s, The Outer Limits and that kind of thing. It just seems weird. So I like the real hand, and I also think it gives us a connection back to Archimedes, who actually wrote with a non-translucent hand. You may be interested to know. But I actually just decided to leave the hand back in. Many people giving MOOCs actually have pre-prepared PowerPoint slides with or without reveals. I found I didn't like that, and when I sort of did some tests and looked at talked to students by and large didn't like it. There's something about the act of writing mathematics and following the writing that's crucial to the learning of mathematics. Interesting, there's some research published, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, about what's being lost when students are no longer being taught cursive writing. And apparently there's potentially a big linguistic loss in language command when you type things. There's something about writing the words that helps with the cognitive development. That's relatively recent research. At least there was some recently that was a big story in the States. So nobody knows what happens when you change the way you learn these things, but certainly in the case of mathematics, there's good reason to believe that at least for many of us, and certainly people of my generation, you can't separate the learning of mathematics from the writing. That's in line with many other things about learning mathematics. I mean, not least of which is the fact that our command of numbers is forever locked to the language in which we learnt it. If you're in a math class, in a second language class, you're absolutely at a disadvantage because you have to translate back to your own language. You get very fast at doing it. You translate back to do the processing. The processing is locked in with the linguistic forms that you were using when you learned it. And there's reasons to understand that in terms of what it means to acquire numbers, but that's a separate story. But in general, there seems to be a good reason to think that the process of writing it is very valuable. Having said that, it has to be said, and I'll come back to this, the vast majority of my students were in fact older people. In fact, 80% of them had got degrees already, which is a standard fact about most MOOCs at the moment. So they were people who'd already grown up through a system where they'd learnt mathematics by writing it. But there's good reason to believe cognitively that's valuable. Okay, so you see me writing it, and I speeded it up for the sake now, but I sort of go through it. So in other words, I want to simulate sitting next to me. That's what it was all about. It was sitting next to me. I recorded these at home. It's not high-tech. Absolutely wasn't high-tech. I could have spent more money and sort of got worried about the sound and everything, but I really wanted the technology to be deliberately cheap-looking. I didn't worry about whether the paper was aligned with the screen size. I didn't worry about it was totally horizontal or vertical. I wanted to simulate putting a piece of paper down on the desk and writing on it. If there's a mistake, and many of the pages have mistakes, it gets left up. The stuff just gets left up. You see it as it is. It was recorded as live, and then I simply speeded up the video. Okay, and I speeded up the video here. In the class, I didn't speed up the video, but I did speed up the handwriting to match the voice. So I recorded as live, but then compressed the video to match the voice. And interestingly, a large number of students did not realize that the handwriting had been sped up. They simply didn't realize that. They just, I guess, assumed I could write very fast. But that was kind of nice to know because it meant that it was obviously a natural thing to do. Okay, the reason it was important to have the hand, and this is very typical of advanced mathematics, and this may not apply to your discipline, but this is one of those cases where you look at the way people learn what you're talking about, and then you make the technology support what works best. And what happens, and this is universal in mathematics, there's been studies on this as well, you write a proof, and when you write a proof, every single student, if you do it well, and you're good at explaining, every single student follows every step. If you then say, okay, what was the big idea in the proof, they haven't a clue, because they've followed it locally but not globally. So almost universally what professors do is, when you've described the proof, and you've got the students to understand it step by step, you explain the whole proof, and now you've got a geographic terrain that you're going to navigate, and that's where the hand was important. On a tablet, what came next was completely impossible to follow, because the hand guides the eye that guides the mind, and so what happens next is when I take the students through what we've just done and go back and forth and navigate that space that we've just created. Come on.
Proves that there are infinitely many primes.
There we go.
Let's just take another look at what we've done. We start with a list of all of the primes. Or we try to list all of the primes. We have to show that we can do that and keep going. Okay, so we start with a list of the primes. We assume we've reached some stage n. N could be a 10, a million, a billion, a trillion, whatever. We reach some stage, and we show that we can always find another prime bigger than the last one. How do we do that? Well, there's a clever idea. We look at this number big N, which means you multiply the first little n primes, that's a little n there, you multiply them together and you add 1. N is certainly bigger than the last one in that sequence. So if big N is prime, then it's a prime bigger than Pn. Now, we're not saying that big N would be the next prime after Pn. In fact, it almost certainly wouldn't be, because big N is a lot bigger than these numbers. So this number is a lot bigger than Pn. So this isn't going to be the next prime, almost certainly. But that doesn't matter. We've shown that there is another prime, and whatever the next prime is, we'll put it onto the list.
Okay, so again, this was recorded as live. It wasn't scripted. I did it in advance, and I've given this course for years, so I sort of know the material. But I deliberately wanted to just recreate what would happen if the student was next to me. So, example, halfway through, I realised I've taken the terrible choice of notation pedagogically because I have to talk about big N and little n. But that's what you do all the time in mathematics. You just, you've got standard notations. This is a standard mathematical notation. It's meant to introduce students to university mathematics. So this is all fine because this is what university mathematics, it's the way it's done. So you just live with what you've got. Occasionally something went so badly wrong in the recording I just scrapped it and started again. But for the most part, it was recorded as live. In the real world, you don't get to rewind what you've just done, and so I didn't want to do that on video. Because this actually wasn't the heart of the course. This was just to give examples of how you think mathematically. The heart of the course was the student work, not my work. So these are just examples, and you live with your mistakes. And I actually did want them to see me making mistakes, and I don't have to fake mistakes, no one does. They just happened, and they're up there in video many years afterwards. A couple of times the mistakes caused so many students to start posting on the website about there's a mistake, and sort of diverting things, that actually what I did was at the end of the lecture I put on a little bit of the lecture, and it says, you may have noticed there was a mistake 20 minutes ago, here's what the mistake is and here's why it arose, because it saved me having to keep answering it. And so now they have the fun of seeing the professor make a mistake, which all students love to do, me included, and then later on at the end saying, well done, you found a mistake, it's a genuine mistake, and here's where I screwed up. Okay, so I just turned those into teaching moments and added them on. And I certainly didn't go back and erase that part of the tape. I only erased mistakes when they would mislead students in a very unfortunate direction. And then I did sort of make a few tweaks over the sessions. Okay, so that was why, in my case, I kept the hand in. There was good reason for doing that, and it worked for my course. There's good reason why Sal Khan doesn't do it with his. Okay, let's move on. In terms of MOOCs in general now, and not just mine, in case of my particular course, that was the aim of the course. How do you solve a novel problem? Classically, mathematics has been a series of recipes. Going to a math class was essentially like going to a cooking class where you learn recipes. I'm not trying to teach people how to follow a recipe, I'm trying to teach them how to cook. Okay? And so it's about how do you solve a problem when you don't know what the recipe is? How do you just go about solving it? How do you justify it to yourself and to others? How do you argument in a group? What does it mean to be a proof of something? Why are mathematicians so certain about the things they've established? Other people aren't in other disciplines, or at least they shouldn't be. Are you able to recognize and check whether a piece of reasoning is valid? Can you construct a proof? That's what it's about. It's about the art of mathematics, the practice of mathematics. And it's absolutely nothing to do with recipes. That's why I wanted it to be a small book, because the book is the textbook. The book is tiny, it's about 100 pages, and there are no recipes in it. And that was really what the whole point was. It was to say you can buy the book, and there's the book, and you might enjoy having the book, and you can read the book, but it's not a recipe book. It's how do you cook book. Okay. The obstacles in my case was that I couldn't check proofs by machine, so I can't tell them whether they're right or wrong. And in fact, most students will never have their attempts viewed by an expert. I can get them to read each other's proofs, and I do, but it means they're never going to get good feedback. In the case of mathematics, that's a huge, huge problem. Less so in other disciplines, but for me that was a big one. And a lot of my effort came from trying to get round that. And I did find a way of getting round that I'll talk about in a minute. I'm going to talk about it now, I guess. I actually just de-emphasized constructing a proof. This was huge for me. Even if I give this course again in classrooms, which I will never again spend a lot of time showing students how to create proofs. For the good reason, 99% of them will never need to do that. What they will need to be able to do, and everybody does in the 21st century, is see whether a piece of mathematical reasoning is valid or not. Boy, knowing whether something is true or whether someone's pulling the wool over your eyes is huge, absolutely huge. And when I hear people like presidents of the United States make statements like it's just metadata, I think, are you kidding me? What's left other than metadata? Good grief. So, actually, if you apply this technique to almost everything the NSA has said over the last year and a half, it's hard to find anything they've said that's true and honest. I guess they're in the job of telling lies, but just this one check, it's all illogical. It makes no sense. It's internally inconsistent. But there we go. That doesn't seem to stop people doing stuff. Okay. So I've actually changed the way I give this course forever now. It's always about being a consumer of mathematics, not being a producer. And in the case of online courses, that's certainly a much more valuable thing to do. Make people sensible consumers of mathematics. Don't assume that they want to or will need to produce it, because there's actually an oversupply of people who can produce it. The world is not short of people who can produce good mathematics. It's really short of people who can evaluate it and make good use of it. The way I do that, in case of that, is I took a rubric and redesigned it, but I used rubrics in a different way. I use rubrics in order to evaluate proofs, not to grade them. Okay, so I use a form of calibrated peer evaluation, which I'll say a little bit about, but not much. So the emphasis now is on being a consumer of mathematics. In the case of evaluating proofs, I show them how to evaluate it. There's a lot of effort put into that. It does involve use of that rubric. Then at some stage, when they've done a lot of doctored examples, I get them to grade each other's work, to evaluate each other's work. And that's using a technique that was developed in many places, UCLA in particular, some years ago. If you do this properly, it actually does produce results as good numerically as instructor grading, because anyone who's graded a large class of mathematics papers knows that it's nothing like objective. Well, in fact, one of the first things students realize is how hard it is to be objective in grading something that's supposedly objective, like mathematics. It isn't. It's human-generated. It's difficult to evaluate. It's maybe a little bit easier than grading an essay, but not much. Because proofs are just essays. They're essays about mathematical objects. So you can get as good as a human instructor. That just shows that human instructors are not that good, because it's an impossible task. But it can certainly, the act of doing it can really produce good learning. So the learning is powerful. And the meta lesson is that just because an instructor says that piece of work is only worth a C, doesn't mean to say it is. It might be only worth a D, it might be worth a B. Okay. The evaluation rubric itself, I took an existing one and doctored it. It doesn't matter what it is. This is the page that they can print off on a PDF, which shows them how to grade proofs according to 3 categories: novice, apprentice, and practitioner. It's actually a 5-point proof with a summary, a 5-point scale with a summary scale. It was designed to help students grade and evaluate papers from the point of view of correctness, not assigning a numerical grade. So it looks sort of like that. We're talking about arguments, so there's logical correctness, clarity, opening, conclusions, reasons, and then they have to summarize everything to be an overall evaluation. So it came from looking at the act of grading evaluations, evaluating proofs. And after they get trained at using that on some examples I've created for them, then if they stay on for the last 2 weeks of the course, they get to practice on each other. They get to spend 2 weeks being professional mathematicians. So there's 8 weeks of basic stuff, which is for everybody. Then students who want to sort of know what it's like to be a mathematician, and that would be anyone who wants to be a math teacher should be doing that. Then they get to practice on each other in a totally harmless, and if they want, completely anonymous environment. So for 2 weeks you get to be a mathematician with all consequences off the table. So the evaluation was developed to help the evaluator understand the proofs. It's not to make the evaluation objective, because that's essentially not possible. It's used in conjunction with tutorial videos that I've designed specially to bring out aspects of proofs. They do use it to provide a sort of grade because they're pretending they are mathematicians. In the final course activity, which I call test flight, it's about, you're in a plane, you're going to try, or at least you're in a simulator, you're going to fly in a simulator and just see what it's like to be a mathematician. And this is what roughly 3,000 students tried, and about 1,700 about 1,700 students tried this, and about just under 1,000 sort of did pretty well at it, actually. And that's and that technique is actually now used throughout the course. Right from the beginning of the course, they get to evaluate specially worked out examples, and then in test flight they look at each other's work. Okay, so we're coming towards the end now. It's about learning about proofs. That's why we use that's what this thing's designed to do. And I've more or less said this already. During the course of as the course progresses, right from the second week, they get shown purported proofs, pieces of reasoning. They have to judge whether that piece of reasoning is good, sound, whatever, according to the rubric. So it's being a sophisticated consumer that I want them to do. And as I say, this is a total change in the way I construct courses. And I think one of the things that will happen if you start to give a MOOC is you will end up, because based on the feedback you get, is making significant changes in the way you go about things. So it's about being a good consumer. They evaluate according to the rubric. They enter the score on the website. The system, and this becomes something that's measurable by machine. I can measure how close they are to my evaluation. And I can adjust my evaluations based on the feedback if it seems as though something's gone wrong and there's a big mishmash. But it does give a degree of objectivity based at least on the expert. I'm supposed to be the expert. I guess in some ways I am, but given that there are no real experts. So they can at least measure their performance as against mine. That's a valuable guide. It's the guide that we always use in the business. But as they learn, and as I keep emphasizing, my evaluation is not the right one. It's just the one that there is. I've got some more experience, so it's perhaps it's worth listening to. But as I tell them, they may instinctively be more strict than me or more relaxed. They can judge how close they want to be to me. The value is compare their grade to mine, and the machine does that for them. And then after they've done that, I put up a video, one of the more tedious videos. These are very tedious videos because I spend 10 minutes grading a proof and explaining all my reasoning in gory detail so that they can see the thought processes. So it's get inside the mind of someone who's been doing it for years, and then they do that all the way through. So that's a new activity that could really only be done in an online setting, and it was introduced in order to make something work online, but I actually think it was pedagogically extremely valuable. So I would never, ever do anything differently, and I did this kind of thing with my Princeton students this spring, even though they were in the class.
Well, for question 4, we have to use the grading route.
This is a tutorial video.
And as you'll see, this is going to involve some significant qualitative judgment.
And here I do have
separated out grading into
prepared slides,
6 different criteria.
because the focus is elsewhere.
For each one of these, we're going to have to exercise judgment. So you're going to find this challenging at first. In fact, you'll find it challenging even at the end of the course, although hopefully you'll have got more confidence in doing it. And in the process, you'll have understood more about mathematical proofs.
So this is a 10-minute video. It only is of interest if you've actually solved the problem and if you've gone through and tried to grade it yourself. And what happens then is the students go onto the threads, the discussion threads, and argue at length about the degree to which they agree with me. And that's the whole point. It's not that they have to agree with me, it's that they can argue about whether they think I was been right or wrong in the numbers that I assigned. And here there's an example that was chosen so that everything was correct except no reasons were given. And I wanted to emphasize the fact that a proof without reasons isn't a proof because it doesn't stand up in court. The reasons are the things that you need to present in court, the evidence, in other words. Okay, but that was 10 minutes. Only makes sense if you've gone through the process. And then the whole point was to get them to discuss. Everything on the screen was to promote discussion among themselves. That was really what this course was about. So it really was a connectionist MOOC. So again, this is the pedagogic model. Work in small groups, classical. And the one thing that I added, because it was valuable in my case, was evaluating work of fellow students. And to make that work, I gave them lots of examples that were not from fellow students, but were doctored to sort of bring out particular points. And as I say, the goal was to get them to work together in groups. In terms of MOOCs in general, and let's broaden the lens now as I wrap up, actually building those communities is not easy. NovoEd's put a lot of effort into theirs. Coursera provides pretty crappy support for doing that, actually. They're not well suited for doing that, and I hope they would get better. They're just to let the groups build themselves. You need to put a lot of effort into performing group interaction, especially if it's a massive course, because they've only got themselves to rely on. Making peer evaluation better is clearly important if we need to use it. There's the issue of accreditation, which is a big issue. A lot of students want accreditation. We need to develop appropriate metrics, both for instructors and students and for platforms. We need to make sure these can work over mobile networks, low bandwidth connections. And if you're in the business of ed tech, eventually you need revenue generation. Actually, even the content providers need revenue generation. I don't, because I'm at Stanford. Stanford pays my salary, they pay some support. So I don't need to generate revenue, and Stanford's not interested in revenue, and it frankly doesn't need it. But of course, there are many universities that do need the revenue. Georgia Tech needs the revenue. That's why it's got a master in computer science. So many good universities that are not well endowed, like Stanford and Harvard and places, do need the revenue, and so there's the issue of business models. So there's a bunch of things still being worked on. As far as peer evaluation is concerned, that's basically the Moneyball effect. Can you replace expertise by crowdsourcing? Almost every domain that it's been applied to, starting with baseball, the answer is yes. I'm almost certain, and I think the evidence is almost there already now, that in terms of what actually passes for grading by people, crowdsourcing is just as good if the crowd is big enough. So I don't think I've got a unique ability. If we can crowdsource it to people with enough background, we can crowdsource evaluation where the grade is at least as valuable as if it's done by an expert, and in many cases more so. So peer evaluation is the big data answer. Big data sets trumps almost any expertise and any theory. Happened in linguistics, happened in machine translation, you name it. Happens in library science to a large extent. Big data sets win, and I think that's true here. So peer evaluation, I think, is going to work as well as we can want it to work. Accreditation, that's already been taken care of by some of the platforms, like Coursera has Signature Track, where you can actually sign up and pay $100, and then you have to take an exam under controlled conditions. They test your typing. They get your digital fingerprint for the keyboard to sort of check that it's you, or sort of you, all the way through. And so you can sign people to MAC addresses of machines and so forth. So you can control at least as well as you can in a physical environment that doesn't require fingerprints and things of that nature. There's also a number of for-profits starting up. This is one, a couple of guys I know in Palo Alto started this a couple of years ago, small company, a company called Accredible. There's a whole bunch of them that will provide ways of tracking your... They're assuming that you're going to build up a portfolio from the different platforms, and they're trying to be one of the companies that gets accepted as being a sort of providing the imprimatur of accreditation. I think one thing that for sure is going to happen is education and accreditation will become separated. There's just no need to have them together, which means... And one of the things I loved about the MOOC was it was a non-credit MOOC. I didn't have to worry about giving credit or grading them. That wasn't what it was about. Which meant I could focus entirely on the learning without feeling responsible for them getting a reliable grade, because there wasn't a grade being given. And someone else can provide the accreditation. And this, I think, is where there's money to be made, and money is already being made. There's another company called Degree that's doing that, and a whole bunch more. And these are not universities. But I think the days when university degrees as credit will matter are probably going to go away, because I think the credit is going to be given by other organisations, because people will pick and choose what the courses they take. And so they won't be taking a Stanford course. I mean, a Stanford degree. They'll take some Stanford courses, etc., etc. Maybe Stanford, maybe the elites will still function that way, but most universities, I think, won't. They'll just be part of the spectrum. Because the customer can just shop around and is shopping around. And so I think that is already showing strong signs, and the EdTech investment is certainly recognising that there's money to be made there. And finally, I think it's finally, let me mention there's one other thing that's going on in the MOOC space where money is already been made in large amounts and where MOOCs are incredibly well suited, and that, of course, is corporate training. This is where Udacity went when it realised it wasn't providing anything in the education space. This was an article produced in Forbes just last year, but here we're talking about a huge market. There we go. In the US alone, it's a $125 billion a year market, and a lot of it's provided in-house, but it can also be provided by other suppliers. And since edX is public, the edX platform is actually, as an open source platform, is turning out to be the default platform that a lot of the companies that are getting into this space are starting to use, including my own startup company, as I mentioned earlier. So that's a big market. And this is very different because, by definition, these are students who will know how to learn and are motivated and have an objective. So these are students who don't need to be in a classroom. So here, the MOOC can operate in full flood, and it is operating. And I suspect universities, if they want to make money out of MOOCs, forget students, look at the corporate market, offer courses for the local corporations. And if you can couple the MOOC with online, with classroom presence, maybe at the end of the semester, which was sort of the old university, open university model, you took your courses on TV and then you went to one of the open university retreats, that I think is a huge potential market. So I think there's money to be made even for universities, but it's not by being universities, it's by being suppliers to in-house training for corporations, which have a lot of money. Okay, that's more or less where I wanted to end up. And I'll just sort of say, why would you want to give a MOOC if you're thinking about it? Here's my answers. And this is the Stanford answer, basically. Stanford's answer is why we're interested in MOOCs, is it's a wonderful opportunity to provide, to look at higher education and reflect on it. So it's research. It's educational research with very large data sets and very rapid return of the data. So it's a great way to do research in teaching. Most people who've given one say they'll never teach the same way again. In particular, it's a good way of developing materials for flipped classes. One of the reasons people originally said, and one of the reasons I got into it 2 years ago, was this idea. This is very alluring. Change the lives of many people around the world. Well, it turns out that most MOOC students live in the developed countries, and 80% already have a degree. So in terms of numbers, we're not changing the world. But actually, how do you change the world? You change the world one person at a time. This is the one that I ended up thinking about. Yeah, okay, I've got 100,000 students sign up, 80,000 turn up. In every course I've given, there's been 30 or 40 students who are absolute rock stars. I had 2 this last semester who I learnt later on in the course were a brother and sister in Pakistan, early teens. I think one was 11, the other was 14 or 15. They were 2 of the best students in the class. I know from emailing with them that they had nothing like that available back in Pakistan. I don't know exactly where they live. They certainly don't get access to YouTube there. But their lives have been changed. There was no doubt about it. Their lives have been changed. And if they're the only 2 lives I've changed, that's good for me. This is the cool stuff. These guys write to you. That's the feel-good stuff. The 100,000 is irrelevant. You've literally reached 2 people that would never, ever have had that opportunity in their life if it weren't for that MOOC. There's nothing that matches that. Those kids are going to do well. They were in my course. They were in the Penn course on calculus. They're known. They follow me on Twitter. I'm expecting to get an email from them in a few years' time saying, will you give me a reference? And by golly, I'll give them a reference. Those kids are going to go places. And there are people in the world whose lives are being changed. And it ain't about the numbers. It's about the accessibility. That, I think, is the cool stuff. If you want to feel good, that's the thing to focus on, because you get that. I'll stop there. I've got a little 3-minute video I'll show if we need to about Stanford. I think I showed it last time as well, but we're sort of close on time, I think.
I think that maybe we want to use that questions instead of the video.
Yep.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, the video is in case it's dead silence. I can just put 3 minutes of video up.
Okay. So maybe we can just leave that up
Yeah.
for there now. And I think before we do anything else, we deserve a round of applause, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can tell you. All right. So we're just going to leave the floor open. If there are any questions you would like to field for Keith, last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
We have one here, sir.
Yeah, I tweeted you said C MOOCs are for humanities and X MOOCs are for maths.
Well, yeah, they're crude, but yeah.
Then you went on to say why you taught an X maths. You taught a maths course and it was vital to have a C MOOC approach.
Yeah.
That seemed a little bit contradictory, but anyway, I tweeted it out.
No, it's not, because it was in the advanced maths. It's not a beginning. It's not an instruction math. It's about mathematical thinking. So it's very much about. Well, insofar as that distinction has any meaning, I mean, most MOOCs are actually sort of in the middle ground anyway, the grey area. Yeah, the course was all about, because what was really going on, and the students who did well were the ones who formed communities and worked together. And that was what the whole thing was about, forming communities. Because that's how math's done in the modern world anyway. You know, when I grew up, it was a gladiator sport. You know, it was mano a mano sort of stuff, and it was literally male mano a mano back those days. I guess it's still like that at MIT, but yeah, it's all about collaborative work and bringing different perspectives and discussing things. Because mathematics in the real world doesn't have right answers. It has good answers, better answers. It's about thinking about problems. The problems come to us messy, undefined, underspecified, where people just want to make better decisions. You know, the idea of mathematics being right answers to precise questions, even when I was growing up, was a fiction that only existed in the math class, and it's totally gone now. So I'm trying to prepare people for using mathematics in the real world, and it's got to be about discussion and collaboration and arguing, because that's how it's done anyway. Yeah. Okay. It's always the people on the front row. I've got 3 hands on the front row, but
We'll have to save them and come back.
yeah. But we can, because we've got the panel discussion this afternoon. Basically, I'm throwing stuff out now. Yeah.
Just post them on
Yeah.
the Twitter.
Yeah.
We will remember, or
Yeah.
we remember them for the panel discussion. We'll get back to it. But
Yeah.
Marie, you have the last word here.
Okay, thank you. I think this is very exciting. But at our university, we also talk about failure rates.
Yeah.
And you were talking about having a few people in whose lives you change.
Yeah.
But all those others who dropped out of your course, maybe you've given them a failure experience. Maybe you've also given them you've changed their life.
Yeah. If they view it as a failure experience, I mean, there's nothing I can do about that. In fact, the whole course is about the fact that mathematics, like everything else, is about learning to live with failure. And one of the things they see, and if they engage, is that if you're not failing, you're not learning. That you learn when you're at the limit of your competency and you're failing. And I keep hammering that home all the time. The example that I use, the metaphor I use all the time, which I think is extremely valid, and I use it to the point of tedium, and that's deliberate, is it's like riding a bike. I use that one because it works for me, but it could be swimming. No one learns to ride a bike by watching a video or by reading a book. You learn to ride a bike by falling off a bike. There's no other way. You get on a bike, you fall, and riding a bike means figuring out how not to fall. And I use that as my metaphor and say that what you do in mathematics, you do in everything else, you fail, and you learn from the failure. So the course itself is built upon the idea that you fail, and you keep getting it right. That's why I ask them to do problems before showing them the answer. I want them to fail again. Then, after they've had the experience of failing, give them a nudge that shows them how they would have avoided failing to the point where they don't need the nudge anymore. So, but if at the end of the day they drop out for whatever reason, and many students drop out, and we know about that, they never intended to do otherwise. I've signed up for 7 or probably more now MOOCs just to get a flavour from them. I've never got beyond the first 2 or 3 weeks in any of them. So according to the statistics, I've dropped out of the course. Well, no, I never intended to do any more. So I think people obsess about those numbers, which meant something if you're in a physical classroom, but mean absolutely nothing online, because the cost of signing up is 0. So I think those are sort of irrelevant. If you poll the students at the beginning, and we do poll them at Stanford as to, do you intend to finish the course, then the failure rate is very low. Students who sign up intending to take the course, by and large, do. If you charge them as little as $40 or $50 to sign up, they will probably finish the course. The dropouts are just epiphenomenal because of signing up means nothing. But if you really do the evaluations and you look at you do the questionnaires and you find out their intentions, then the dropout rates are no different from in a physical university. They simply don't drop out if they never intended to drop out. And in fact, under those circumstances, you can look at those figures, because if students who intend to finish are not finishing, that's useful feedback that you maybe need to change something in the course. But by and large, those figures are really spurious and just inappropriate in the online space, at least the free online space. Yeah.